Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host and presenter for this episode titled Syrian Immigrants to Rutland, a Story of Neighborhoods. In the unlikely starting place for this story is at a clothes tree on Granger Street. So let me give you a little context. I moved to Rutland in 1983 to begin teaching at MSJ, and during my first year I lived in the Tedesco's house upstairs in the back. They were very good people to me, very kind. They would sometimes send up food. But in my second year I had the opportunity to move just a couple of blocks away to a house at 72 Granger Street that had been in the Chaffee family probably since the late teens. And you can see in this picture at left is a recent photo that I took of this house. But what you can't see in this picture that I will get to in a moment is the good-sized yard between 72 Granger Street and 78 Granger Street, which is on the same side of the street going south. And where you see this view of the house from the backyard looking north, right off the porch when I was living there was a clothes tree, a four-sided clothes tree. One of the benefits of my moving to this house is that it had a washer. And anyone that knows that you have to go to the laundromat, it's not a fun thing to do. So probably on a school afternoon, a nice day, I had done my laundry and brought the basket out, and I was starting to hang my clothes on the clothesline. And all of a sudden, I felt someone at my left, and it was Grandma Agnes Chaffee, who lived at the house that you can see in the rear, and she told me that I wasn't hanging my clothes correctly. And before I could even react to this, from the other side of the house at 78 Granger Street, the other neighbor, Mrs. Lizzie Webb, said to me, "Where were you brought up? Don't you know how to hang your clothes properly?" And I really didn't know what they were talking about. So Mrs. Chaffee said to me, "Put the clothes back in the basket." So I did. So I have these two elderly women going through my laundry basket, and they sorted it out the way that they wanted the clothes hung in their neighborhood. So it would have been sock, 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 t-shirt, t-shirt, t-shirt. You get the rest of the picture. So they also said to me that in this neighborhood, Monday was the preferred day for washing. Well, that didn't work out with my schedule. So about 4 or 5 days later, when I had enough laundry to do a load and it was a nice afternoon, I went outside to the clothes tree and I began in my haphazard fashion of hanging the laundry, and I put sock, t-shirt, face cloth, and I looked across the yard, and from between the blinds I could see Mrs. Webb shaking her head that I wasn't doing it right. I put everything back in the basket and I hung it to the satisfaction of the people who were watching out for me. And ever since that time, I have been very nostalgic about the sense of neighborhood that that end of Granger Street experienced. Because as I mentioned, you have the Chaffee house that I lived, the other Chaffee house. Across the street at the corner of Granger Street is where Catherine Gincola lived. Lizzie Webb lived at 78 Granger Street in this house. And one of the things that from my conversations with Lizzie, she was a very reserved woman. And I could tell that she had a bit of an accent from somewhere. So I asked her one day, "Where did you grow up?" And she said, "Lebanon." And I can remember when I looked at her phone number in the phone book, I needed to call her about something. Her husband's name was Webby Webb. So that became another opportunity for me to ask her a question. And I said, how did your husband get the name Webby Webb? And she said, changed at Ellis Island. You'll see that that isn't true. The other thing that's part of the story of the people in this neighborhood, and the story that really is the focus of this presentation on Syrian immigrants to Rutland, is right across the street from Mrs. Webb, in this duplex house, 81 and 79 Granger Street, lived Emul and Betty Kessa. And I would often see Lizzie Kessa walking across the street, and Betty Kessa walking across the street to see Lizzie. And I knew somehow there was a family connection there, that there was a relationship between Lizzie Webb and Emul Kessa. And this picture, taken fairly recently, is not the way that I would have remembered Emul and Betty, because they often in nice weather sat on their porch, and it was always decked with beautiful potted plants. So Lizzie, I found out when she passed away in 1996. This is a very, very limited obituary. You can see that she was still living on Granger Street before her last illness. I knew that she had no children, but I thought, what's the story here with Elizabeth's family, her husband named Webby Webb? What was the connection with the Kessup's across the street? And that is what I'm going to delve into with research. So we'll start with Lizzie's husband, John Webb. But as you can see here from his birth abstract, he was Webb John Webb, born in Rutland in 1903. It gives his birthplace as Lebanon Mountain, Syria, which is Mount Lebanon, Syria. We'll talk about that. But why would someone who was born in Rutland have the same first and last name? This mystery took a long time to solve. In the 1940 census here, you can see how little the neighborhood changed over time, because the first name that you see here with a surname is Catherine Webb, which would be Lizzie's mother-in-law. In 1940, she was 76 years old, a widow born in Syria. There is her son, Webby Webb, John Webb. The ages here are a little bit off, because if John were born in 1903, he only would have been 37. And then you can see Lizzie, Elizabeth here, is the daughter-in-law. And then in the house where I lived, you have Frank, Josephine Chaffee, Carmel Chaffee, Musella, and then the list of their children ending with Funzie Chaffee. And then at the bottom of the page, you can see Anna Kessa, who would be Emul Kessa's grandmother, and she would be 75 years old, born in Syria. But remember when I said what to Lizzie Webb, where did you grow up? She said Lebanon. So why are all these people saying that they were born in Syria? We see here the gravestone for Lizzie Webb's mother-in-law, Catherine Webb. Here is her death certificate from, she died at the Rutland Hospital in 1946. Her maiden name was Corey. And once again, we see Lebanon here. And here is some good detail in her obituary from the Rutland Herald. Mrs. Catherine J. Webb, 83, of 78 Granger Street, died at Rutland Hospital yesterday after a long illness. Mrs. Webb was born in Syria and came to Rutland from Egypt 45 years ago. She was survived by two sons, Elias and John Webb, both of Rutland, etc. Now this is the key that links the two families together. Mrs. Webb, Lizzie's mother-in-law, was the sister of Emul Kessa, who was Emul's grandmother. So you have two sisters born in Syria that lived on Granger Street across from one another. Lizzie's uncle was named Elias Webb, and this is his passport application from 1914. And you can see here it gives his name, and he was born in Mount Lebanon, Syria. He gives his father's name as John Webb, and the purpose of his obtaining a passport was to visit relatives back in the old country. And the wonderful thing about these online passport files is that they include a photograph of the person. So here is what Elias Webb looked like, who would have been an older brother-in-law of the Lizzie that I knew. We can see here that Elias Webb, the brother-in-law of Lizzie, also lived on Granger Street. This is his World War II registration card. And here we have his World War I registration card of when, by this time, he was a naturalized citizen. He is working at the Lincoln Iron Works in Rutland. He has a mother whom he is supporting. And very interestingly here, it doesn't say that he was born in Syria or Lebanon. It claims here that he was born in Port Said in Egypt. In the 1910 census, we see this John Webb, his wife Catherine, and various children. And I could not find this family in 1900, at least according to the census indexes that I had access to, but I'm still puzzled over the name Webb. And why is it that John Webb would become known as Webb Webb? And we can see a little bit more here that John Webb, the father, so this would be the father-in-law of Lizzie, he died at the age of 53, residence 78 Granger Street, born in Syria. He died of pulmonary tuberculosis. We have a brief funeral mention about him. And part of the story that we are unfolding here is that I'll show you a map momentarily of what Mount Lebanon means. And what we have to understand is that this part of the Middle East prior to World War I was all part of the Ottoman Empire. And there was no nation state known as Lebanon as we know it. But on the map here, you can see in purple a semi-autonomous district of Syria that was known as Mount Lebanon. And in this area of Syria, nearly all of the people were Christians, and many of them were Maronite Catholics. So when these immigrants came to Rutland, even though they may have been of the Maronite rite, they still belonged to the Catholic Church. And the challenges of immigration in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, you can see from where these people are, they would have traveled by rail, probably to Alexandria or Port Said in Egypt. They would have taken a vessel across the Mediterranean to a place like Marseille, and from Marseille they may have traveled to Le Havre or another port. So it was a very, very complicated journey for them to get back to America. Now, here is how we begin to unpuzzle the Webb-Webb mystery. Because Webb, as we know, on the surface of it, does not look like a Syrian or Lebanese name. One of the older members of the family who lived for a time in Rutland, but eventually moved away, we know that his name was Webby, or some variant of that. So the original name was something that sounded like Webby. So when John Webb was born in Rutland in 1903, he took his original name as a first name. So he became Webby Webb or Webby Webb. So there's the story behind the name, that it wasn't Webb in the first place after all. So going back to the Kessas, let's look a little bit at their immigration story. Emul Kessa, whom I remember from sitting on his porch, he lived pretty much all of his life in that house on Granger Street. He was 72 years old when he passed away. His wife, Betty, survived him by many years. And I do remember when Betty was about 85, she smelled smoke in her house, and she had the sense to get out. But there was a fire in part of her house, and there was some major reconstruction that needed to be done. If you look at Emul Kessa's obituary here, it states that he was born in Rutland on the 17th of July, 1918, the son of Elias and Hannah Kessa. And this is where it gets a little complicated when we look back in records, because in the 1920 census, once again, this is on Granger Street, we can see Emul's grandmother, Anna, who is the head of the family. And remember, at this time, her sister, Catherine Webb, lives across the street. But we have a son, Edward. And Edward really isn't Edward, he is Elias. So Elias, who was Emul's father, anglicized his name to Edward to sound more American. And one of the funny things about this census entry is you look at the household here, so you have Edward, his wife Anna, son George, and then it says Emily here, a daughter. Well, this isn't Emily, it's Emul, and someone got it wrong when they were taking the census, probably a language barrier issue. And the Emul's grandmother, Anna, died at Rutland Hospital. We can see the information on her death certificate, and we have her funeral notice from the Rutland Herald that says, largely attended funeral services for Mrs. Anna Corey Kessa of 81 Granger Street, widow of Simon Kessa, who died Saturday at the Rutland Hospital, were held yesterday morning at 1 o'clock at St. Peter's Church. And interestingly here, as we read down, we see that some of the bearers at her funeral were Shaheen Haddad, Elias Haddad, and Russell Haddad of Willimantic, Connecticut, and then another Haddad from Montreal. Now, as I'm finding out this information, keep in mind that even if I pursued questions to Lizzie Webb and Emul Kessa all those years ago, there wasn't the availability to look up information at the time. And now we are indeed very, very spoiled with what we can access for information from digitized records. And here we have Emul's father, this time is Edward. His occupation is an engine hostler, and this is his petition for naturalization when he was 25 years old. And if you notice here that it gives his birthplace in Syria, and that he renounces his fidelity to Mehmed V, Emperor of the Ottomans, and it tells us here that he immigrated through New York in 1895. Now, the name Kessa has various spellings, and I think in one of the census entries that I have here, if you look back at this one from 1920, you can see the name is spelled with a C. So I haven't yet located the ship manifest by which members of the Kessa family came to America, but probably the name as we know it spelled in this community, Kessop, was not the original spelling of the name. Like so many other names of immigrants, it became transformed over time. As I was researching some background information on this story, I encountered an extraordinary book that is available. It's been digitized at archives.org, and it's called Mount Lebanon to Vermont, the autobiography of George Haddad, who was one of the first Syrian immigrants to Rutland. And you can see here at right is a picture of George with his daughter Emily, who was his scribe in writing down this information. And it says here his son Elias, who was responsible for his father's safe return to this country at the outbreak of the European War, and that is World War I. Some wonderful anecdotes in this book, and there is an introduction by John A. Meade, who had been the governor of Vermont. And he says, Mr. Haddad should have the endorsement of the patronage of Rutland, for he is a man industrious and trustworthy, honorable and patriotic, being very loyal to the beloved country of his adoption. His principles of integrity in his relations to his fellow men should find a cordial recognition from every resident of this city, which he and his loved ones now call home, and where he has resided for 22 years, respected and honored by all. And what I find so interesting is that in this life of George Haddad, which deserves to be rediscovered, we get a sense of his complex immigration route to Rutland. And we get a little glimpse of this here. In his travels, he landed first in Massachusetts. He said he found some Syrians living at Center Street in Rutland whom he had known in Egypt. I returned to North Adams and told my wife of beautiful Vermont and its green mountains, and we decided to move to Rutland after selling our furniture. That was in August of 1894. And he goes on to say, we lived at Center Rutland at first, but Mrs. Haddad liked to come to Rutland to do her shopping. And in October, we moved to the city and have lived here ever since. All my 6 children now living were born in Rutland. And then he goes on to say that he sent money to his mother and hoped that he could get her from the Ottoman Empire, but that became impossible with World War I. And in the 1900 census, we see just how many people from Syria had settled along with the Haddads. And I counted up, and there were at least 20 or more people actually born in Syria. So here we have George Haddad and his wife Mary, and then their children born in Vermont. And also he has a sister-in-law living with him and a niece. So we have a chain of migration from the Middle East to Rutland. This is George Haddad's obituary from the Rutland Herald in April of 1945, shortly before the conclusion of the war in Europe. And it says, widely known Oriental rug dealer, had been a Rutland resident since 1894. George Harvey Haddad, widely known dealer in Oriental rugs, died yesterday morning at Rutland Hospital after several months' illness. Mr. Haddad had been a Rutland resident since he came to this country from Syria in 1894. He is believed to have been the the first Syrian to become a United States citizen. He wrote an autobiography prefaced by Governor John Abner Meade entitled Mount Lebanon to Vermont. Mr. Haddad made 19 trips to Syria during his life here, the last one being in 1935. And we have documentation of all of that. And early on, George Haddad in various censuses was described as a silk peddler or a peddler, but by the time of his death, rising in self-esteem, he is known as an Oriental rug dealer. This was a real surprise for me to uncover the complexity of these stories. And once again, it all begins in a neighborhood and the people who live there. And these immigrants who were ethnically Lebanese, Christian, immigrating to Vermont by way of Egypt, France, transatlantic voyage, they liked it here enough that they stayed here. And when I think of that neighborhood where I lived for 6 years, pretty much all the original owners are no longer living there because Lizzie Webb, Catherine Giancola, Agnes Chaffee, etc., all of those folks would be well over a century by now. And I think that as we look forward to the history of our community and the role that immigrants have played in coming to Rutland, there's history that we would be wise to recover. And there are fascinating stories if we go looking. And as I have often said with these broadcasts, that there is a great deal of history that is easily accessible to us through the pages of the Rutland Herald. So there you have the story that started at a clothesline and ends today with these remarkable stories of immigrants from the Ottoman Empire who chose to make Rutland, Vermont their home.